Well, Joel just helped me remove the engine from that black 300 SD. This is the engine that's going to go in Digby. And we were talking about the advantages of removing an engine from an old diesel. Now, of course, if you're going to overhaul it, you need to remove it. Or if you're going to replace it with another used engine, you have to remove it. But I was trying to explain to Joel, there's a time when you might want to consider removing an engine from one of these old diesels when there's a lot of work that you need to do on the engine itself. Now, it's going to take about 4 to 5 hours to get the engine out and another 4 to 5 hours to get it back in if you're so mechanically inclined. And I've got a complete checklist on how to do this on my website, and we'll be going over it also in the Digby series. But I just want to go around this engine right now, just briefly, and show you a number of major jobs that you might have to do to one of these old diesels, and it would be easier to do it out of the car. Granted, it's that extra 8 to 10 hours, but you're going to spend more time trying to repair some of the stuff with the engine in the car. Plus, you'll be able to get it out of the car. You'll be able to see everything, replace things like motor mounts and hoses and all that other stuff. And when you put it back in, you know you got everything fixed. Let me start out by showing you one of the most common oil leaks on these old diesel engines. Here's the oil filter housing on the OM late model 616 and OM 617 engines. And that right down in here, where this aluminum housing bolts up to this cast iron block, it tends to leak oil. And if I wipe my finger down here, you're going to get oil, although this one's not too bad. But when you do this job here, you have to disconnect a lot of things that are really close to the steering box. And it can be tough. It's not a lot of fun. A lot of people have done this. So if you have a leaking gasket behind this oil filter housing, plus you might want to replace these oil cooler hoses right here, this is a lot easier to do it out of the car. Although this wouldn't warrant just removing the engine for this job, but when you start thinking about things like, oh, I need to replace the motor mounts down here, or I need to replace the engine shocks, and then you get over here and you say, maybe I need to replace the AC pump. That's another one that's pretty tough to get to. And that's just on this side. You may say, well, I might as well pull this power steering pump off and reseal it while I'm at it. And then, of course, you've got things like injectors, injector overhaul and glow plug replacement. That's not a major issue with it in the car. Now, I'm going to take you around to the other side and show you some other items. Okay, on the passenger side of the engine, you may need to replace the gasket for the intake and exhaust manifold. And you can determine whether or not that's the case by looking for staining. You'll get black staining around the exhaust manifold. You'll get maybe a little oil around the gasket. And this would be the time to replace that gasket when it's out of the car, as well as rebuilding the turbocharger. You know, we have a kit that will allow you to rebuild these turbochargers yourself. But let me tell you, it's a lot easier to do the turbo rebuild with the engine out of the car. And then coming down here, we have a special kit. You can see what this person has done to solve this turbo drain pipe leak. You know, he's used a lot of silicone here, but he's put a absorbent rag to try to stop the oil leak. And fixing this oil leak here with these seals in this tube is a lot easier with the turbocharger off. And of course, taking the turbocharger off is a lot easier with the engine out of the car, although you can do this job, as I point out in my instructions. You can get under the car and replace this without having to remove the turbo, but it's time consuming. You may lose an hour right there. So I think you can see what I'm getting at. And then moving along here in front of the engine, this is another big one, is the front crank oil seal right in here. The front crank oil seal, needs to be replaced on these engines after 20, 30 years. And replacing the seal is a lot easier with the engine out of the car as well. Then you have other things like this short hose right here and the thermostat. And there's a few other gaskets, like the gasket in the vacuum pump right here can leak. And of course, you'll get a chance to replace the belts and the hoses. And even these flexible hoses right here for the transmission cooler should be replaced when the engine's out of the car. Once again, that's not a big deal to replace it in the car, but I hope you realize the point I'm trying to make here. When you add all these together, I believe there's a time savings, a stress reduction by taking the engine out of the car when you're doing all this kind of work on one of these old diesels.